we, at the same time, have reached a point in the evolution of our movement, which sets the stage for my next part of my presentation, that recovery advocates today are beginning to say, somewhere in the industrialization and commercialization of addiction treatment, something very precious got lost. In the movement of addiction treatment to an ever more acute model of intervention, I'm expecting drive-by treatment at any moment. It is getting so brief. And what the advocates are telling us is this. Somewhere along the line, this thing we call treatment became disconnected from the larger and more enduring process of addiction recovery. And what we're having advocates right now, whose earlier generations spent their lives building the foundation for us to meet in this room, that are saying it is time we fundamentally redesigned addiction treatment in the United States with a focus on long-term personal and family recovery. And I will reference that as we go forward. This brief history that I've reviewed with you raises interesting questions. Given these centuries and now decades of modern development, what can we say we know, not about addiction, not about the psychopathology of addiction or the neurobiology of addiction, but what do we know about this thing called recovery? And what do we know about it from the standpoint of science and history and decades of accumulated clinical experience? And I want to highlight some of the work that Dr. Kurtz and I have done trying to pull some of these questions together with answers. To do that is forcing us to begin with by far the most difficult task, and that is what's recovery? And defining that in ways that we can measure and we can track that over time. There are multiple efforts here and around the globe right now as we are shifting from a traditional pathology and treatment paradigm to a growing emergence of a recovery paradigm as our organizing center for the field. There's increasingly concern around how we define this concept. Many efforts. In general, what we're seeing is a cluster around three definitional components. The first of those, if you look at the Betty Ford Institute definition, is sobriety. Others will identify this first component in terms of remission, meaning that when we survey people, we will identify people who once met DSM-4 criteria for abuse or dependence, but have not met that criteria in the past 12 months. Are you with me? We haven't referenced anything related to abstinence or sobriety. We're simply saying they once had the disorder, they no longer have the disorder. Other groups are saying remission is not enough. We have to begin to talk in terms of abstinence or sobriety. That debate is continuing. But what's important for us in this room is that there are two additional components of this definition, which says that recovery is more than the elimination of alcohol and drugs from an otherwise unchanged life. And it says we must see two other things, and that is because addiction is so devastating to so many dimensions of one's intrapersonal and interpersonal life, we must begin to see progress towards global health. And by global, we're talking about psychological and emotional and relational and occupational and spiritual. We're also beginning to talk about there's probably few disorders that are more socially alienating than is long-term addiction. So we're talking about recovery also involves a way of finding a pathway for reintegration to building a life in the community and outside of the world of subterranean drug cultures. So with that definition in place, on a parallel track has been the question, well, what do we know? We measure in incredible detail the slightest shifts in marijuana usage and marijuana attitudes and attitudes towards methamphetamine and this and that and the other. And we spent millions and millions of dollars creating a research industry to track this trend. So let me ask a couple very quick questions. Are there more people in recovery in the city of Boston today than there were last year? Of the people who are in recovery within the city of Boston, are there different recovery rates for men and women? Are the recovery rates different by age? Are they different by ethnic subcultures? Are they different for people with co-occurring psychiatric disorders compared to those without those disorders? And you know what? Historically, we could fill libraries with what we know about addiction, but we can't answer some of the most basic questions related to recovery. As a person in long-term recovery, the biologists at NIDA have continued to tell me that my brain was hijacked, but they never told me when I was going to get it back. Are you with me? They've told me about the neuropathology of addiction, but they haven't laid out the neurobiology of long-term addiction recovery. They tell me my children are at higher risk for addiction because of my family history. They can't tell me if my recovery status has anything to do with their vulnerability, increasing or decreasing or no effect. They can't tell me as a parent, is there anything I can do as a parent to alter their vulnerability? Or anything I can do if they should develop a disorder that would shorten their addiction career and lengthen their recovery career. They can't tell me what are the long-term temporal benchmarks of long-term recovery. They can't tell me what's the impact in the cycle of recovery for the family. They can't tell me as people age in recovery, and some of those individuals relapse after 20 and 30 years of recovery, what are the issues related to relapse after prolonged and stable recovery? Because that kind of a research agenda simply hasn't been on the drawing board. We could barely fill a shelf in our addiction studies libraries with what we know about the recovery experience, but we can fill whole buildings about what we know about the pathology of addiction. As we look at the issue of recovery prevalence, I've just finished a monograph looking at about 415 community and clinical studies. And one of the things that we're beginning to try to say is, look, we have millions of people in long-term recovery in the United States. It's time we began to study the solution to this problem as opposed to study the problem and extract lessons out of that lived solution. Well, when people say, what do you mean there are millions of people? Says who? Well, we've looked at every major epidemiological survey that studied remission from alcohol or drug dependence. The estimates right now in the current population in the United States, extrapolated from those studies, the best science we have, range in estimates between 25 and 40 million people in the United States in recovery from alcohol and drug dependence. If we look at issues related to rates of recovery, and we're talking two groups, rates of recovery in non-clinical community samples, and then rates of recovery within treatment samples. And you're going to see in the numbers below here, we're basically at rates of about 50% in community samples, about 47, a little over 47% for clinical samples. And if you look at the studies published since 2000, we're actually over 50% recovery rate, which I would suggest in and of itself should challenge the public perception and growing pessimism around recovery, because addiction is incredibly visible in this culture. Every day we have celebrities heading off to rehab after their latest crash and burn. But the second they stabilize and get in recovery, that story is not told in this country.